I'd always been drawn to solitude, finding comfort in the quiet places that others avoided. That's why, when I stumbled upon the clearing deep within the forest, I thought I'd found the perfect spot to camp for the night. It was secluded, untouched, and surrounded by towering trees that formed a natural barrier from the world outside. It felt like a sanctuary, a hidden gem that no one else had discovered. The sun was beginning to set when I set up camp. I pitched my tent in the center of the clearing, built a small fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last through the night. The air was cool, and the forest was eerily silent, no distant hum of traffic, no sounds of other campers, just the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was perfect. After a simple meal cooked over the fire, I settled in, enjoying the peace that only a place like this could offer. The sky was clear, and through the canopy of trees, I could see the stars twinkling above. It felt good to be alone, to have escaped the noise and clutter of the world for just one night. But that peace was shattered when I awoke in the middle of the night. At first, I didn't know what had disturbed me. The fire had burned down to embers, casting weak shadows across the clearing. Everything seemed as I had left it, the tent, the fire pit, my backpack by the tent entrance. But something felt off, like the air itself was charged with an invisible tension. I glanced around, my eyes adjusting to the darkness, and then I noticed it. The fire pit had been rearranged. The stones I had carefully placed around it were no longer in the same position. They formed a new pattern, almost like a ring, with the remnants of the fire smoldering in the center. My heart began to race. I hadn't heard anyone approach, hadn't seen or sensed another soul, but someone or something had been here, and had altered my camp while I slept. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself that maybe I had just been more tired than I realized, and didn't remember how I had arranged the stones. Maybe the wind had blown them, though that didn't make much sense either. I checked my belongings. Nothing was missing. Nothing seemed disturbed. It was just the fire pit. I forced myself to lie back down to ignore the gnawing feeling of unease growing in my gut. But sleep didn't come easily, and when it did, it was restless and filled with strange, fragmented dreams of shadowy figures moving through the trees. When I awoke again, it was just before dawn, and I immediately knew something was wrong. The tent was wrong. It had been shifted, not just slightly, but enough that I could see the difference. It wasn't in the center of the clearing anymore. It was closer to the trees, the entrance facing a different direction. My backpack, which I had left by the tent flap, was now on the opposite side. The fire pit had been altered again, the stones now arranged in a tight spiral. My pulse quickened as panic began to set in. This wasn't my imagination, and it certainly wasn't the wind. Someone had moved my tent while I slept, rearranged my belongings, messed with me. I scanned the tree line, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the forest was still, the trees looming over me like silent sentinels. I had to get out of there. I hastily packed my things, throwing them into my backpack with shaking hands. I needed to find the trail and get back to civilization. But when I tried to retrace my steps, something was wrong, terribly wrong. The path was gone, or rather, it had changed. The way I had come in the previous evening now led deeper into the forest. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth thicker, and the more I tried to find my way back, the more disoriented I became. Every turn I made, every attempt to backtrack, only seemed to lead me further into the dense, darkening woods. The forest was alive with sounds now, branches creaking, leaves rustling, the distant hoot of an owl. But it felt hostile, as if the trees themselves were watching, waiting. The clearing, when I stumbled back into it, was no longer a refuge. It was a trap. My tent was gone, vanished as if it had never been there. The fire pit, too, had disappeared, leaving no trace in the ground where it had been. The clearing itself seemed smaller, the trees pressing in from all sides. I couldn't breathe. I spun around, desperate to find a way out, but the forest was closing in, the trees bending and warping as if to mock my attempts to escape. Every path I took led me back to the same spot, the same damned clearing, which was now almost completely overgrown with thick, twisted roots and thorny bushes. I yelled for help, my voice echoing back at me through the trees, but there was no one to hear. I was alone with the forest that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, twisting reality around me. The sun was setting again, but there was no comfort in the approaching night. Only the growing certainty that I was trapped in some kind of nightmare. The air grew colder, and the shadows lengthened, creeping toward me as if they were alive. And then out of the corner of my eye I saw movement, a figure, barely visible between the trees, standing still and watching. I whipped around, but there was no one there. Just the trees, standing silent and tall, their branches tangled in a web of darkness. I was losing my mind. That was the only explanation. The forest was playing tricks on me, warping my perception, twisting reality until I couldn't tell what was real and what wasn't. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. The forest was alive, and it was toying with me, trapping me in a loop of confusion and dread. I don't know how long I wandered, trying to find a way out. Hours, days, time lost all meaning in that place. The clearing would appear, disappear, reappear, always slightly different, always more oppressive. The trees drew closer, their branches tangling above, blocking out the sky until I was enveloped in darkness. I lost all sense of direction, all hope of escape. The forest had swallowed me whole, and there was no getting out. I was exhausted, terrified, and on the brink of madness when I finally collapsed, too tired to go on. I lay there on the cold ground, feeling the forest closing in around me, the roots and vines curling around my limbs like tendrils of some ancient, malevolent force. And then, just as I was about to surrender to the darkness, I saw it, a light faint, flickering, but unmistakably there. It was coming from deep within the trees, far beyond the clearing, where the forest was thickest. It shouldn't have been possible, but I had no choice. I dragged myself toward it, the light growing brighter with each agonizing step. It was hope, the only hope I had left, and I clung to it with every ounce of strength I had. The light led me to a small, dilapidated cabin, hidden deep in the heart of the forest. It looked ancient, the wood rotting, the windows dark and cracked, but the light was coming from inside, spilling out through the gaps in the walls, beckoning me. I hesitated at the door, my hand trembling as I reached for the handle. Something told me that whatever was inside that cabin was worse than anything I had faced in the forest, but I had no choice. I had to know. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. The light came from a single lantern, flickering on a wooden table in the center of the room. The air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay, but there was something else, something I couldn't quite place. It was familiar, and that familiarity filled me with a deep, inexplicable dread. The walls of the cabin were covered in strange symbols, carved into the wood with a rough, uneven hand. They seemed to pulse with a life of their own, shifting and changing as I stared at them. My head spun and I had to look away, and then I saw it. In the corner of the room, shrouded in shadow, was my tent. My backpack, my sleeping bag, everything was there, exactly as I had left it. But it wasn't possible. It was as if the clearing itself had been transported into this cabin, a twisted, distorted version of the camp I had set up. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. I hadn't found the clearing. It had found me. The forest had drawn me in, led me here, to this place, this cabin that shouldn't exist. And I knew with a sickening certainty that I was never getting out. I backed away, my heart pounding, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. The light in the lantern flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness. The walls seemed to close in, the symbols glowing faintly, casting eerie shadows across the room. I was trapped, surrounded by the relics of my own camp, caught in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. And then, out of the darkness, a voice whispered my name. I turned, but there was no one there, just the darkness pressing in, the symbols on the walls pulsing like a heartbeat, growing louder and louder until they filled my ears, my mind, my very soul. And then I understood. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry, and it had chosen me. The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed me was the sound of my own screams, echoing through the cabin, through the forest, swallowed up by the trees that had closed in completely, leaving no trace of the clearing, of me, of anything. Now, as I write this, I don't know if I'm still in that cabin, or if I've become part of the forest itself, another lost soul trapped in the endless, nightmarish loop of its twisted reality. But if you ever find yourself alone in the woods, and you stumble upon a clearing that seems too perfect, too peaceful, turn back. Leave immediately. Because once the forest chooses you, there's no escape. I'm not a superstitious person. I've spent years camping in remote places, where the only sounds at night are the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of nocturnal animals. To me, nature is a sanctuary, a place to escape the noise and chaos of everyday life. But that night on the moor, I encountered something that shook me to my core, something that I still can't fully explain. It started out as a simple enough idea. I was going to spend the weekend camping on the edge of a moor I had never visited before, known for its haunting beauty and eerie tranquility. The moor stretched out for miles, a vast expanse of wild grassland shrouded in mist even on the sunniest of days. Perfect for solitude, I thought, for getting away from it all. I arrived late in the afternoon, the sky a dull gray as if the sun had already given up on the day. I found a spot that seemed ideal, a small clearing on the edge of the moor with a few sparse trees to shelter me from the wind. As I set up my tent, the mist began to roll in, thickening with each passing minute until it became difficult to see more than a few feet in front of me. I didn't mind the fog. It gave the moor a dreamlike quality, a sense of otherworldliness that appealed to my love of the unknown. I set up a small fire and cooked a simple meal, enjoying the silence. The only sound was the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the grass. As darkness fell, the fog grew even thicker. I could barely make out the shapes of the trees around me, their branches stretching like skeletal fingers into the void. I was alone, completely alone, and that was exactly how I wanted it. But then I heard it, a soft crunching sound, like the snap of a twig underfoot. My first thought was that it might be an animal, a deer or a fox perhaps, but something about the sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It wasn't just a random noise. It was deliberate, careful, as if someone or something was moving through the mist, trying not to be heard. I stood up slowly, straining my ears. The fog was so dense that it absorbed sound, making it difficult to tell where the noise was coming from. I called out, my voice sounding small and muffled in the thick air. "Hello, is someone there?" No response. The silence that followed was so complete, so absolute, that it was almost as if the moor itself was holding its breath, waiting. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold night air. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, just on the edge of my vision, a figure standing still in the fog, its outline barely discernible. I turned quickly, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there, just the swirling mist. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The fire had died down to embers, casting long flickering shadows across the ground. I added more wood, trying to push back the darkness, but the light only seemed to make the shadows deeper, more menacing. The crunching sound came again, this time closer. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the fog, but again there was nothing. Just the mist, thick and impenetrable, and then I saw him. The figure was there, standing still at the edge of the light, just out of reach. He had no face, at least, none that I could see. His features were blurred, indistinct, as if the fog itself was a part of him, or he a part of it. He was tall, unnaturally tall, with limbs that seemed too long, too thin. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure didn't move either. He just stood there watching me, or maybe not watching, since he had no eyes that I could see. But I felt his gaze cold and empty, boring into me. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Was it a person? A ghost? Something else entirely? Suddenly, the figure shifted, not walking, but somehow gliding closer, still keeping to the edge of the light. I could see more of him now, a long coat that seemed to blend into the fog, and hands that were pale, almost skeletal. Panic surged through me, and I turned to run, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the ground had turned to quicksand, trapping me in place. The figure moved again, closing the distance between us, and I felt a coldness wash over me, so intense that it burned. I forced myself to look away, to break whatever spell held me, and when I did, I could move again. I bolted for the tent, diving inside and zipping it up as if that flimsy barrier of fabric could protect me. My heart was racing, and I was drenched in sweat despite the cold. I sat there, huddled in the darkness, listening. But there was only silence, no footsteps, no rustling, just the thick, oppressive fog pressing in on all sides. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, it was hard to tell. My mind was playing tricks on me, every shadow a threat, every creak of the tent a sign that the figure was near. I tried to calm myself, to rationalize what I had seen. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, a reflection in the fog. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I must have drifted into a fitful sleep. When I woke, the fog had thinned slightly, enough that I could see the pale light of dawn filtering through the tent fabric. I unzipped the tent cautiously and peered out. The moor looked different in the daylight, less sinister, more peaceful. There was no sign of the figure, no footprints or disturbances in the grass. It was as if the night had been nothing more than a bad dream. But I knew better. I knew what I had seen, what I had felt. The figure was real, and he was still out there, somewhere in the fog, waiting. I packed up quickly, eager to leave the moor behind, but as I walked back to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, a shadow that didn't belong. By the time I reached the car, I was nearly running. I threw my gear in the back and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. As I started the engine and drove away, I caught one last glimpse of the moor in the rearview mirror. There, standing on the edge of the fog, was the figure, watching me leave. His featureless face turned toward me as if to say, "You can't escape." I never went back to that moor. I told myself it was just a bad experience, a hallucination brought on by fatigue in the eerie atmosphere. But sometimes, on foggy nights when I'm alone, I think I see him again, just a shadow at the edge of my vision, always watching, always waiting. And I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't looked away? I've always loved the solitude of the wilderness. There's a kind of peace you can only find when you're miles away from civilization, surrounded by nothing but the raw beauty of nature. I've hiked through some of the most remote places in the country, places where the trails are barely marked, and the maps are more suggestion than guide. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the ancient forest. The forest wasn't on any of the popular trails, and that's what drew me to it. The locals called it Whispering Woods, a name they said came from the way the wind moved through the trees, creating an eerie, almost whisper-like sound. I'd heard the stories, tales of lost hikers, strange noises, and a darkness that seemed to swallow all light, but I dismissed them as folklore. After all, I'd been through worse. The forest was massive, its trees towering high, their branches thick and tangled like skeletal arms reaching toward the sky. Even in the daylight, the canopy was so dense that only slivers of sunlight managed to pierce through, casting the forest floor in a perpetual twilight. It was exactly the kind of place I wanted, a challenge, a mystery to unravel. I spent most of the day trekking deeper into the woods, far beyond where any trails led. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the silence was almost oppressive. There were no birds, no rustling of small animals, just the crunch of my boots on the undergrowth. It felt as though the forest itself was holding its breath. By the time I found a suitable spot to set up camp, the sun was beginning to set. I chose a small clearing surrounded by ancient gnarled trees that looked as though they had stood for centuries, their bark rough and dark like old leather. As I pitched my tent and gathered wood for a fire, the quiet began to weigh on me. There was something unnerving about it, something I couldn't quite place. As night fell, I sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. The light barely reached beyond the clearing, swallowed up by the darkness between the trees. I tried to enjoy the silence, to lose myself in the comfort of being completely alone. But the stillness felt different now, heavy as if the forest was aware of me, watching me. Then I heard it, a faint whisper so soft that I almost didn't catch it. It came from somewhere deep in the forest, carried on the wind like a distant echo. I turned my head, listening, but there was nothing, just the crackling of the fire and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. I told myself it was just the wind, just the forest settling as the temperature dropped. But then I heard it again, closer this time, more distinct. It wasn't just a sound, it was a voice. A whispering voice, speaking words I couldn't quite make out, as if the language was too ancient, too foreign for me to understand. I sat up, my heart beginning to race. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, but I saw nothing. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the wind. I tried to shake off the unease, but the whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It wasn't the wind, I knew that now. The whispers were too deliberate, too human. I stood up, clutching my flashlight, and shone it into the forest. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only the tangled roots and twisted branches of the trees. But the voices, they were still there, growing louder, as if they were all around me, surrounding me. I tried to focus to pick out individual words, but the language was still alien to me, a garbled mix of sounds that sent chills down my spine. And then, amid the incomprehensible whispers, I heard something I understood. My name. It was faint, almost swallowed by the other voices, but I heard it clearly. Someone, or something, was calling my name. Panic surged through me, and I backed away from the edge of the clearing. The whispers were coming from the darkness, from the trees, from the very air itself. They were growing louder, more desperate, more malevolent. I retreated to the fire, the only source of comfort in the growing madness. I threw more wood onto the flames, making them blaze higher, trying to push back the encroaching darkness. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more insistent, the voices overlapping, calling my name over and over again. I covered my ears, but it was no use. The voices were inside my head, seeping into my thoughts, filling my mind with their ancient, incomprehensible language. And with it came the overwhelming sense of dread, of something ancient and evil lurking just beyond the light, watching me, waiting. The whispers began to form words, sentences that I could understand, though I wished I couldn't. They spoke of the forest, of how it had been there long before humans, how it was alive, aware, and how it hungered for those who dared to enter its domain. They spoke of sacrifices, of souls lost to the darkness, of blood spilled on the roots of the ancient trees. And they spoke of me. They knew my name, knew why I had come, knew that I was alone. The whispers told me that the forest had chosen me, that it had been waiting for someone like me, someone who sought the solitude of the wild, who was arrogant enough to believe they could conquer it. The firelight flickered, casting wild shadows that danced across the clearing. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and decay, and the whispers were growing louder, filling the night with their terrible secrets. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my pack and my flashlight and ran. I didn't care where I was going, didn't care that I might get lost. I just needed to get away from those voices, from the terrible things they were telling me. But as I ran, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees loomed larger, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, grabbing at my clothes, my hair. The whispers followed me, growing louder and louder, the voices rising in a crescendo of madness. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing to the ground in a heap. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices that filled my mind, my soul. They told me I couldn't escape, that the forest had claimed me, that there was no way out. I looked up, and there in the darkness I saw them, figures barely visible, moving between the trees. They were watching me, just as I had feared. Their eyes glowed with an eerie light, and their whispers filled the night, echoing in my mind. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The whispers grew louder, drowning out everything else, until all I could hear, all I could think of, was the voice that spoke my name over and over, like a twisted mantra. And then, just as suddenly as they had begun, the whispers stopped. Silence fell over the forest, a silence so profound that it seemed to swallow everything. The figures in the trees were gone, the glow of their eyes extinguished. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, echoing in the stillness. I didn't know how long I lay there trembling, too afraid to move. But eventually I forced myself to stand. The forest was still dark, but the oppressive weight of the whispers was gone. The air felt lighter, the trees less menacing. I stumbled back to the clearing, half expecting the whispers to start again, but they didn't. The fire had burned low, but it was still burning, a small beacon of light in the darkness. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, my back to a large tree, clutching my knife, waiting for the voices to return. But the forest was silent. When morning finally came, I packed up my camp as quickly as I could. The forest looked different in the daylight, less threatening, almost peaceful. But I knew what lay beneath that calm exterior, knew that the forest was watching, waiting for the next traveler to stumble into its grasp. As I hiked out of the woods, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that the whispers were just waiting for the right moment to return. The air felt thick with unspoken words, secrets that the forest wanted to share with me, wanted to force into my mind. When I finally broke free of the trees and reached my car, I didn't look back. I couldn't. I knew that if I did, I might see those figures again, standing just at the edge of the forest, watching me leave. I've been on plenty of hikes since then, but I've never gone back to that forest. I know it's still there, waiting, its ancient trees hiding dark secrets, its whispers calling out to those who are foolish enough to listen. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind is just right, I think I can hear them again, those faint whispers carried on the breeze, speaking in a language I can almost understand, calling my name. But I won't go back, because I know that if I do, the forest will claim me for good.